The Great Depression is often narrated as a spontaneous malfunction of markets, a lightning strike no one could predict and no institution could redirect. Introductory surveys point to October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, and treat the crash as a freakish rupture in an otherwise steady narrative. Yet, behind the schoolbook summary lies a starker interpretation. The calamity did not merely happen to the financial elite. It unfolded in ways that enabled those closest to the levers of credit to steer outcomes. And in the wreckage, they found opportunities to buy cheaply, to reorganize rivals, and to strengthen their command over the system itself. The disaster that delivered hunger, unemployment, and grief to millions functioned for a prepared minority as an opening. Understanding that possibility requires stepping beyond a single week of chaos and following the long preparation. In the late Gilded Age, money and law braided together. Industrial trusts perfected lobbying, bankers perfected syndication, newspapers aligned with financiers to shape public expectations. In 1913, out of anxiety about recurrent panics, the Federal Reserve was created. It was marketed as a stabilizer, a neutral referee with instruments to add or subtract credit for the public good. In operation, it concentrated extraordinary authority over money and interest rates in a network tied to the country's largest banks. The rhetoric promised safety. The structure awarded leverage to those nearest the tap. During the Roaring Twenties, that hidden geometry revealed itself. The Fed kept rates low, brokers lent freely, and advertising glamorized leverage as a democratizing tool. Margin finance turned clerks into speculators. Investment trusts layered debt on portfolios with soothing talk of diversification. Columnists and radio hosts repeated the creed of a new era in which modern management had conquered risk. Prices rose because credit expanded because prices rose. Behind the curtain, insiders trimmed positions as early as 1928, while policymakers began to tighten. Public cheerleading persisted, but the foundation shifted. When the turn came in October 1929, the architecture of margin amplified the fall. Mark-to-market collateral plunged. Brokers issued calls. Investors sold whatever could be sold, pushing quotes down further. Households discovered that leverage works in reverse with terrible speed. Meanwhile, cash-rich buyers and banks with privileged access to liquidity met fear with patience. Factories, rail rights, utilities, city properties, and entire banks went to auction. The few bidders with dry powder and reliable funding accumulated assets at fractions of prior prices. A shock that obliterated small savers' equity became a season of acquisition for institutions that could wait and choose. Policy after the break compounded the asymmetry. Instead of aggressive accommodation, monetary conditions tightened through contraction and adherence to gold constraints. Bank failures multiplied from 1930 through early 1933. Each closure evaporated deposits and destroyed community knowledge about creditworthiness, the informal understanding that sustains local borrowers through a rough season. As small institutions vanished, their customers were left to plead with regional or money center banks that did not know them and would not extend grace. The same event, tight money, looked like prudence from a boardroom and like strangulation on a county main street. Contemporaries spoke bluntly. Henry Ford accused financial interests of throttling smaller producers while ensuring that the giants found ways to refinance. Whether one credits his motives, the outcome is visible in the data. Far fewer banks by the mid-1930s, a higher share of resources in fewer hands, and a hierarchy reinforced by regulation that ostensibly aimed at neutrality. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation and other crisis agencies were explained as system savers. In practice, they often reached the largest, most connected counterparties first, on terms that allowed strategic mergers and asset purchases to proceed. The microstructures of the 1920s boom deserve attention. Call loan markets let brokers roll overnight, borrowing forward as long as prices cooperated. Investment trusts sometimes pledged the same collateral chains. Prospectuses promised safety with language that blurred the boundary between diversification and leverage. Media echoed the optimism because media owners, advertisers, and banks moved in overlapping circles. It was not merely irrational exuberance. It was exuberance cultivated by people who profited from participation. When credit growth slowed in 1928 to 1929, the engine that pushed prices up began to sputter, and once selling started, its speed outpaced comprehension. Events abroad fed back into the loop. The United States emerged from World War I as the dominant creditor. Dollar loans tied European recovery to New York syndicates. Reparations and inter-allied debt intertwined. With the Depression, transfers failed, currencies came under siege, and governments accepted conditions attached to emergency loans. Germany's banking crises, Britain's 1931 exit from gold, and American devaluation in 1933, 1934, all redistributed the pain. The net effect was to reinforce the centrality of New York and London, where a handful of institutions could arbitrate terms for much of the world. Domestically, misery mapped along class and geography. Farmers confronted drought, falling prices, and foreclosure. Black sharecroppers in the South bore compounded losses through discrimination and displacement. Urban workers drifted between job lines and soup lines. Yet integrated corporations in oil, steel, power, and chemicals survived the credit drought by virtue of size and connections. The Rockefeller orbit extended reach in energy. Morgan affiliates continued to coordinate capital flows, even as hearings criticized their influence. Consolidation was not incidental. It was the shape of recovery for those who could absorb competitors. Relief and reform arrived together with procurement. The New Deal built roads, dams, schools, and airports. It stabilized farm prices and shielded bank customers. Contracts, however, channeled to bidders capable of bonding large projects and delivering nationwide. Administrative burdens filtered applicants. As the 1930s rolled on, rearmament accelerated the pattern. Aircraft, shipbuilding, aluminum, and electronics firms, with balance sheets and political savvy, multiplied capacity under federal orders. Crisis reorganized the industrial map around fewer, larger nodes that interfaced directly with Washington. The psychology of crisis was a tool in itself. Booms seduce with stories of destiny, busts terrorize with stories of doom. In fear, citizens tolerate extraordinary measures for stability. Press releases and expert memos, printed in papers owned or funded by the same interests that placed the memos, framed interventions as unavoidable. Technical language insulated decisions from lay scrutiny. Once established, emergency programs tended to persist, changing form and label, but not intent, to guard the pillars of the system while the periphery learned to live with new constraints. This does not require a fantasy about omnipotent conspirators. It requires asymmetries that repeat. Those with early information, established channels to policy, and robust balance sheets can arbitrage chaos. They can choose when to expand and when to force liquidations. When a borrower misses a covenant, the lender decides whether to extend or to call. A call under stress is not a neutral act. It sets a price and transfers control. In the early 1930s, that decision calculus played out across thousands of farms, shops, warehouses, and mills. International institutions at the decade's end formalized the shift. By 1944 and 1945, with war refashioning trade and production, the United States sat at the center of a new regime of payments and credit. The dollar's gold peg, the new multilateral lenders, and American industrial scale stabilized world finance while entrenching the influence of New York and Washington. The Depression, in retrospect, appears not only as a disaster survived, but as a pivot through which power was rationalized and concentrated. Agriculture illustrates the double edge of reform. The Agricultural Adjustment Act pushed acreage controls to lift prices. Landlords collected checks. Many tenants were displaced as fields went fallow. Credit agencies refinanced mortgagors who could navigate the forms and wait. Those without counsel lost titles. The same logic held in housing, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation standardized mortgages that helped millions, while also laying blueprints for risk maps that excluded minority neighborhoods. Aid restored stability while hardening inequalities. Labor's story is similarly paradoxical. The Wagner Act legitimized unions and collective bargaining. The Fair Labor Standards Act set floors for wages and hours. Those gains strengthened workers in sectors dominated by firms robust enough to survive the early 1930s and to standardize contracts at scale. The post-Depression compromise thus linked organized labor to big industry in a framework that privileged incumbents. Stability improved, yet the architecture fixed power in nodes that had been fortified by the crisis itself. Memory, too, became an asset. After the smoke cleared, the prevailing narrative reduced complexity to a parable about speculation and hubris. That parable contained truth, but it obscured the machinery of distribution, who lost, who gained, and by what mechanisms. Textbooks shortened causality to a handful of dates and slogans. Meanwhile, the institutions that navigated the crisis wrote white papers and histories that cast their actions as reluctant stewardship. The more the story hardened, the easier it became to forget the auctions, the foreclosures, the receiverships, and the quiet consolidations. The most unsettling lesson is not that catastrophe can happen, but that catastrophe can be managed for advantage. Control over credit is the power to summon or withdraw oxygen, to set the tempo of liquidation, and to privilege some balance sheets over others. Media power is the ability to frame those decisions as necessity. Legal power is the capacity to translate preferences into regulations and contracts. Where those powers intersect, crises can be channeled. The Great Depression shows how, slowly at first and then decisively, ownership moved while the public searched for footing. By 1945, the United States emerged with unmatched industrial plant, deep domestic capital markets, and a currency that mediated global trade. Banks learned to operate under new disclosure rules. Insurers and pensions became crucial buyers of bonds. Corporate planning adopted wartime logistics as peacetime method. A catastrophe that had starved communities of credit created a platform on which a few centers managed the world's flows. The majority endured deprivation. The minority built an architecture to govern the rebound. History classrooms often end with a warning to retail investors. Beware of bubbles. A more complete warning is this. Beware of cycles that redistribute rights and titles according to who controls credit at the bottom. Crashes are not only storms, they are auctions. Auctions reward those with cash and connections. And when the auctioneer also writes the rules, as central banks and major lenders effectively do, the pattern is predictable. A boom invites leverage. A tightening exposes the weakest. Failures cascade. Consolidators arrive. Recovery proceeds through the very institutions that weathered the drought. Consider the Pecora hearings of 1933-1934, which pulled bankers into the light and documented stock pools, insider allocations, and devices to dodge taxes. The response, Glass-Steagall, the SEC, deposit insurance was real reform, yet it also cemented a perimeter that only the largest players could navigate cheaply. Law both restrained and legitimized their centrality. Emergency money rulings pushed the point further. The 1933 suspension of gold convertibility and the Supreme Court's Gold Clause cases shifted losses by statute, proving that contracts could be rewritten when system survival was invoked. Markets adjusted. Ownership patterns did not reverse. A ground-level vignette shows the transfer mechanism. A regional utility facing a bond maturity begged its bank for a rollover. The bank refused unless control was handed to a receivership. Junior holders were wiped out. Assets re-emerged under a syndicate led by the same bank. Multiply that pattern across farms, shops, rail cars, and apartment blocks. What remains is the durable lesson. Crises are not only misfortunes, but also methods. Control of credit, narrative, and law allows a few to decide the cadence of liquidation and the path of recovery. The Great Depression punished millions and simultaneously organized power. That double reality, not a cartoon plot, is the key to understanding how a financial order survives by changing shape while keeping its commanding heights intact.